The SNP has been in power in Holyrood for 15 years now. In this week's magazine, James Heale, the Spectator's diary editor, and Michael Simmons, our data journalist, write that Nicola Sturgeon has created one of the most opaque and centralised governments in Europe. To discuss, James joins me now alongside Jackie Baillie, Deputy Leader of Scottish Labour. James and Jackie, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. James, you along with our colleague Michael Simmons write this week about the, quote, poor planning, willful waste and absence of accountability, end quote, of the Scottish National Party over the past 15 years in power. What, in your view, has gone so badly wrong?
Well, Kate, I think a number of things have gone wrong up in Scotland. I think the danger is that secret government tends to lead to bad government with a lack of transparency or any accountability mechanisms for some of the failures. So those failures are repeated and exacerbated. And the focal point for this story was looking at the Ferguson shipyard and what's gone wrong there. And now this is sort of 8 years of delay, misspending, and the original budget for these two original vessels has gone from 97 million to 240 million. And so what the real issue is that not things that have gone wrong, but that these failures have been exacerbated by a failure to learn from mistakes. And the danger you have with the SNP, I think, is a party that's been in power for 15 years now and a tendency to think of itself as the state. And the danger is that any criticism is seen as somehow treason, and therefore you do not learn from what's gone wrong previously. And it just means a failure to learn, and that's why Scotland, I think, is suffering in its public sector outcomes.
Jackie, is James being unfair? I mean, things go wrong all the time in the public sector. It doesn't necessarily mean that something particularly sinister is going on.
No, I think he's perhaps being overly generous, if I could put it that way. You know, I've been in the Scottish Parliament since 1999, the very beginning, and I have never seen a more centralising, more secretive government than the one that's currently in power. And James is right. They simply do not accept they make mistakes or indeed learn from them. And what we're witnessing now is very much a centralising command and control structure that's controlled by Nicola Sturgeon at the very top. Dissent is just not allowed. Debate is stifled. And the committees of the Parliament do not have teeth. They don't seem to be able to challenge the First Minister because, of course, the SNP majority votes as one. You know, we don't have independent members on committees. They are very much creatures of their own party. If you take the Ferguson shipyard contract as an example, but it is excessively over budget, documents are missing that would tell us what actually happened, and it seems to be that key points in the contract were based on SNP conference or the referendum. And if you look at the timeline, there's certainly, in my view, not just serial incompetence, which is what I used to think it was, but actually an abuse of power. It is a disgraceful scandal and nobody is shedding light on it, and we need to understand the truth of what went on.
James, can you talk a bit about Nicola Sturgeon's office, which you and Michael mentioned in the piece, how it works and why you think it differs from number 10? I mean, is it really any more secretive than what's happening in Whitehall?
Well, I think in Whitehall you certainly have a degree to which it's based on a balance of power. You know, you have the Treasury, you have the Foreign Office, you have a number of different Whitehall departments competing. And some might say that kind of competition does produce at least a degree of accountability, whereby, you know, you have a number of different ministers who can hold that Prime Minister to account. You know, the Prime Minister here, for instance, in London, doesn't even have a department of his own. Whereas in Scotland, if you talk to civil servants, people involved in the government there, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon sort of looms like a zeppelin over the whole thing. Even sort of minor decisions get signed off by the First Minister, which is why some people find it hard to believe that in the Ferguson shipyard she wasn't involved in signing off any of it, and that's why we've seen a lot of the briefings going on and a lot of the kind of spin that's happened because of what's happened. And what I think is the most important, Kate, is that the Scottish Government was set up and the Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999, and there was a real hope and expectation about it. Here was a chance for Scotland and Holyrood to do much better than Westminster. And the sad thing is that Nicola Sturgeon, a woman who was elected in 2014 as First Minister to be the most, quote, accessible First Minister ever, hasn't lived up to that expectation and promise, and that kind of self-renewal that was hoped for with the SNP when she was named First Minister after Alex Salmond left hasn't really taken place. And so I think the difference between the aspiration and reality, or the rhetoric and reality, is what is most damning about what's gone on in Scotland.
Jackie, James writes about Sturgeon's latest idea. As part of a pandemic law, the Scottish Government would be able to modify or amend any Act of Parliament without a vote. What do you make of those plans? Are they a non-starter in Holyrood?
I mean, frankly, I find them quite extraordinary. It is astonishing what's being described as sweeping Henry VIII powers that the Scottish Government is seeking will enable them, without scrutiny, without approval of the Scottish Parliament, to simply change existing primary legislation in whatever way they wish. Now, I think that, frankly, is just a power grab too far. If you look at the consultation, Civic Scotland is opposed to this. In fact, I think 80, if not 90% of the respondents said that this just went too far and was not appropriate. Unfortunately, the SNP now have a majority in the Parliament alongside their partners, the Greens, and so this will go through unless we can make sufficient noise to stop it from happening. But it is quite extraordinary that they now disregard the Parliament completely. Even during the pandemic, whilst it is appropriate to give people emergency powers, and the Parliament was able to do that quite quickly, the reality is when it comes to laying regulations, they lay them and only seek parliamentary approval after the event. That's not a smart way of doing it if you want to take everybody with you.
But as you say, Jackie, the SNP has their majority. You can make a lot of noise, but realistically, is there much more that you could do to stop them?
Well, I think, and what we've sought to do is when you find that the government isn't listening, then actually making common cause with Civic Scotland, with the experts and the professionals, whether it's in academia or in business, actually bears fruit. Because if the entire country is saying this is not the way to do things, then I do think any government, including Nicola Sturgeon's government, really need to sit up and listen. But I live in hope that might happen. But at the moment, what we're seeing is spin and assertion over evidence and scrutiny. And it's really depressing because devolution could be so much better than this.
James, you and Michael write that there are structural problems in the Scottish Parliament too. You write about the warnings that SNPs were given during the Alex Salmond trial, for example.
Yes, I mean, I think that Jackie touched on an important point, which is that, you know, as long as you can, the one big thing with the Scottish electoral system was that people thought that no one would ever get a majority. But once you've got that, effectively there aren't many checks or balances. You know, compare it to Westminster, where you've got, for instance, the House of Lords, where you've got a much more dynamic political culture in terms of, you know, backbenchers, you know, Conservative MPs holding a Conservative government to account, or the same with Labour. The danger is you don't have those kind of things with the SNP up in Scotland. And I think that the danger is that with some of the Alex Salmond stuff, what went on was, frankly, a very dangerous mix of separation of powers being blurred. And frankly, the mechanism in Scotland was shown to be lacking. And the question is that now we have, as Jackie says, an SNP Green pro-independence government sort of just about propped up. Will we see any of those failures being addressed? And typically what's happened in Scotland over the last 15 years is that failures or institutions which are shown to be wanting have not been rectified, have not had any kind of sort of minor political or constitutional reform. And so it's the institutions that have been found wanting. And the danger is that there seems to be no impetus from the governing parties to rectify that anytime soon.
James, you say in your piece that the boundaries between the party and the state up in Scotland have in some cases become indistinguishable. You mentioned the shipyard. Are there other cases?
Yes, certainly is. And I think that a number of the civil servants up in Scotland, most recently Leslie Evans, who was the permanent secretary of the Scottish Government until she recently left earlier this year, have close connections to the party. And the danger is, of course, is that if you have a nationalist party in government, the tendency is to see that party as the party of government and the only legitimate voice in Scotland. And I think that Jackie and a number of other sort of politicians who take a different view on that have had those voices attempted to be shut down. And I don't think that's particularly healthy or productive for Scots, who at the end of the day have to live with the result of policies that politicians put through.
Jackie, last question to you. You said in February last year, during the fallout between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, that, quote, there's something rotten at the core of the SNP and it is poisoning our democratic institutions, end quote. Now, as somebody who works inside Scotland's political system every day, have you noticed any changes? Have things become better since last February?
No, in fact, they've become worse. I think the Scottish Government is less accountable, more centralising, much more secretive. You know, I lived through the Salmond inquiry, and I have to say the level of obstruction from the Scottish Government was absolutely legendary. You know, we were given papers only after we sought them doggedly for months and months. What we were given was by and large redacted. I mean, I recall a document of 22 pages where 20 pages were actually snow white because everything had been redacted. And they just simply refused to hand over information. I mean, they didn't just do it to a parliamentary committee, they did it in the courts as well, and judges had to order the government to hand over information. But, you know, one example I would give you just recently is where the permanent secretary, who is retiring, was asked to appear before the Finance and Public Administration Committee of the Parliament. You would think it was an opportunity for her to talk about her achievements. She refused to attend. A serving senior civil servant simply refused to attend the committee, and she wasn't held to account by the Scottish Government, and therefore she was clearly too busy just preparing for her retirement. I find that scandalous, that the highest civil servant in Scotland is not instructed by ministers to attend a parliamentary committee.
Jackie and James, thanks for joining me.